the generational perception gap behind Ginge's overwhelming win. Ginge's overwhelming victory this season unfolded with such force and clarity that the moment the percentages became public, it felt as if the entire conversation around what defines popularity shifted instantly, revealing a fascinating generational split that makes me think about how people identify with modern public figures. And I genuinely want to hear in the comments whether you also noticed that shift in your own circles, especially when younger viewers openly embraced his presence while older viewers were still asking who he was. As I watched the reactions pour in, what stood out to me most was how the debate over whether Ginge counts as a celebrity became less about him personally, and more about how each age group defines relevance. Because younger audiences focus on digital influence while older audiences tend to prioritize traditional media, and that tension shaped the entire public narrative in a way I think deserves a deeper discussion right here under the video. What happened once H left the show created a ripple effect that completely transformed the voting structure, since every sign suggests that his supporters moved almost unanimously toward Ginge. And the way this shift happened demonstrates how group identity operates inside fan communities, which is something I find extremely intriguing from a behavioral perspective. So feel free to comment if you also noticed the same voting trend. The huge percentage margin between Ginge and Tom didn't just reflect popularity, but the strength of parasocial bonds that digital creators build over years of consistent engagement. Something that traditional television still struggles to replicate. And when I observed those numbers, I realized how this series became a case study on modern influence, rather than a simple popularity contest, which I think is worth discussing because many viewers underestimate the psychological power of familiarity. Throughout the season, I noticed a recurring pattern. People who had never heard of Ginge before the show became supporters after watching him interact naturally in the camp, while those familiar with him beforehand were already committed voters, meaning the show essentially merged two distinct audience groups into one powerful voting bloc. And I wonder whether you also felt this convergence as the episodes progressed, because it was genuinely striking. The conversation, comparing whether Ginge won because of his digital following or because of his personality, shows how divided the audience is on what authenticity looks like. Yet when I looked at the camp dynamics and how he consistently showed respect, humor, and steadiness, I realized that many people project their own values onto contestants, and I'm curious whether your interpretation matched mine or differed completely. Tom's trajectory in the final days demonstrated something important about television visibility. Even if you do not win, the emotional connection you build with mature viewers can set you up for long-term opportunities. And as I analyzed his behavior, I noticed a calmness and sincerity that many older voters responded to. So let me know if you think he will become more prominent on screens after this. The debate where people said, "I've never heard of Ginge," reveals something deeper about generational communication. Because for younger audiences, he represents a well-known figure in online entertainment, while for older audiences, he seemed unfamiliar. And this gap shaped the tone of many comments, making the discussion less about the show and more about what each generation consumes. One of the strongest psychological factors this season was the humor shared between Ginge and H, which created a family-friendly atmosphere that brought different age groups together, and seeing parents mention that their kids left their rooms to watch the show with them really highlighted how laughter acts as a social connector, something worth reflecting on when thinking about why the series resonated so deeply. When I looked at the voting results, written out entirely in words as required, it felt as though the public wanted to send a clear message that charisma outweighs traditional fame. And this outcome makes me think viewers care less about where someone comes from and more about how they behave under pressure, a point that could spark meaningful debate in the comments. Seeing older viewers admit they didn't know Ginge beforehand but ended up voting for him shows how adaptability shapes perception, because even without prior knowledge, they were able to respond to what they saw in the camp. And I think this says a lot about how open people can be to modern forms of fame when presented authentically. Generational differences became especially clear in the mixed reactions about whether content creation counts as a real career. And analyzing these comments reveals that many older viewers still struggle to understand the professional aspect of digital influence, while younger viewers accept it fully, and this divide shaped the narrative more than people realize. Tom's supporters created an interesting contrast, because their loyalty stemmed more from emotional warmth and traditional relatability, and observing how his calm demeanor appealed to mature viewers made me appreciate how diverse the fanbase truly is, so feel free to comment if you notice the same demographic shifts. Another layer worth noting is the idea that online voting might advantage younger audiences comfortable with technology, while older audiences feel nostalgic for phone voting, and this detail opens a conversation about accessibility, fairness, and how voting systems influence outcomes, something I would genuinely like to hear your opinions about. Every time someone insisted that the vote is fixed, it reminded me how distrust in systems grows when outcomes do not match personal expectations. And as I analyzed the discussions, I realized these reactions reveal more about emotional investment than actual evidence, making this a fascinating example of how disappointment shapes narratives. One thing that repeatedly stood out was how many people praised Ginge's respect for women, seeing it as part of why he felt refreshing and grounded. And when older viewers highlighted how important such behavior is as a role model for young people, it showed how values still matter deeply even in entertainment settings. Observing how viewers of different ages responded to the humor this season tells us something about the universality of comedy. Because even if people were unfamiliar with certain contestants, laughter acted as a bridge that closed the knowledge gap, allowing viewers to judge contestants based on personality rather than prior reputation. When people claimed they did not know Ginge but enjoyed him anyway, it revealed how exposure can rapidly transform perception. And, from a psychological standpoint, this demonstrates the human tendency to form attachments based on observable behavior rather than background, which aligns with broader research on first impressions and parasocial connection. Tom's journey proved that finishing in second place does not diminish long-term public presence, because many viewers expressed that he seemed gentle and genuine, traits that tend to resonate within traditional television formats, and it made me reflect on how visibility often matters more than victory itself. Generational humor became obvious in the comments about Ruby Wax and Ginge being unknown to different age groups, revealing how each generation has its own cultural anchors. And this became a humorous but insightful window into how entertainment landscapes evolve across decades. The moment the voting percentages were revealed, the reaction online felt like a collective exhale, because people could finally validate their theories about how fan blocs were forming. And this reminded me how anticipation plays a major psychological role in viewer engagement. Many people noted that the final four were strong personalities who contributed uniquely to the camp dynamic, and analyzing how viewers distributed their loyalty among them gives us insight into how people value teamwork, humor, resilience, and emotional openness in real-time social environments. Comments about "never heard of him" highlighted a recurring social pattern. People sometimes mistake personal unfamiliarity for universal obscurity, yet the data clearly showed Ginge had immense support, which turns this into a valuable example of how perception does not always reflect reality. When viewers praised how the younger generation embraced Ginge, it created an interesting contrast with the skepticism from older groups, demonstrating how rapidly entertainment preferences shift, and this contrast became one of the most fascinating aspects of the season. Some comments noted that younger voters may have used virtual private networks, which opens a wider discussion about global fan culture and how digital communities transcend geographic boundaries, showing how modern fandom operates in ways older systems never accounted for. The perception that Ginge and H brought families together around the television speaks to the emotional value of shared entertainment, something increasingly rare in a fragmented media landscape, and it highlights how genuine camaraderie on screen can foster connection at home. When people pointed out that humor carried the season, it made me reflect on how emotional relief influences public preference, because viewers naturally gravitate toward personalities who ease tension and offer positivity, traits Ginge demonstrated consistently. Those who argued Ginge only won because of his online followers inadvertently reinforced the idea that modern influence carries significant cultural weight. And this outcome forces us to reconsider what it means to be a public figure in a digital era, where traditional fame structures no longer dominate entirely. Observing how mothers praised his behavior toward women shows how contestants become symbolic figures representing values parents wish to see in society, turning entertainment into a subtle form of social commentary, and I think this angle deserves much more attention. Tom's supporters emphasized his gentle nature and sincerity, which made me reflect on how varied the psychological needs of viewers are. Some seek humor, others' stability, and others' emotional connection, forming a mosaic of reasons behind voting choices. When people said they expected Ginge to win from the moment he entered the jungle, it became clear that perception often shapes predictions long before any voting occurs, revealing the powerful role expectations play in viewer engagement and emotional attachment. The debate about whether streaming counts as real fame touches on deeper societal changes, because younger audiences see digital creators as mainstream, while older audiences sometimes remain skeptical. And this discrepancy creates tension but also reveals cultural evolution in real time. Observing the admiration for H's impact on the show even after his departure highlights how supporting characters can shape a narrative indirectly, and his humour formed a foundation upon which Ginge built momentum, making their synergy a crucial element of the season. Finally, the massive margin of Ginge's win demonstrated how collective enthusiasm can override traditional expectations. And as I break down these reactions, I realize this season became a reflection of modern identity, generational views, and shifting cultural definitions of celebrity. And I genuinely want to hear how each viewer personally interpreted this shift. Ginge's journey through the jungle became a lesson in how authenticity reshapes expectations, because each interaction he had with campmates seemed to build a bridge between different age groups watching at home. And this made me realize how powerful natural behavior can be when people feel tired of polished, rehearsed television personalities, prompting me to wonder how you interpreted his presence as the show progressed. What struck me most as the episodes unfolded was how consistently he responded with a calm tone, even under pressure, which created a subtle psychological effect where viewers began projecting reliability onto him. And this type of steady emotional pattern is something that often influences long-term voting behavior more than dramatic moments. So feel free to comment if you noticed this psychological progression. Throughout the season, the contrast between contestants who relied on previous fame and those who relied on personality became increasingly clear, with Ginge falling into the latter category. And I found it interesting how the public rewarded that approach, suggesting that audiences now prioritize emotional transparency over prestige or career background. Ginge's respect toward women, repeatedly noted by viewers, played a major role in shaping mature audiences' opinions, because small gestures of consideration often stand out more than grand displays. And analyzing this made me think about how viewers evaluate contestants' character using subtle cues rather than dramatic story arcs. As I watched older viewers initially puzzled by his presence gradually warm to him, I realized how exposure changes perception, because familiarity builds comfort, and comfort builds trust, which eventually leads to support, meaning that even viewers who didn't know him beforehand found themselves emotionally invested by the end of the season. Tom's evolution during the final days offered a counterbalance, because his style, gentle, articulate, thoughtful, spoke to the traditional side of the audience. And this duality reminded me that public preference is rarely uniform. Instead, it is shaped by emotional needs influenced by age, culture, and personal experience. When people wrote that Ginge and H brought their families together to watch, I was reminded of how entertainment becomes meaningful when it transforms into shared time. And this transformation reveals that the appeal of humor goes far beyond the individual personalities and taps into a deeper human desire for connection. The moment H left, I noticed a shift in how the camp atmosphere was perceived. Ginge's humor no longer acted as a secondary layer, but became central, and viewers responded to that transition with increased attachment, revealing how group dynamics influence individual visibility in ways we often underestimate. Public debates about whether digital creators are real celebrities opened an unexpected window into cultural change, because younger audiences emphasized impact, while older audiences emphasized legacy. And this conflict shaped much of the commentary, making the season feel like a modern reflection on shifting definitions of influence. One of the most fascinating behavioral patterns was how quickly people adapted once the final three were announced, forming instant narratives about who deserved to win, even though some had discovered the contestants only weeks earlier, demonstrating how storytelling psychology shapes live competition shows. As Ginge continued demonstrating supportive behavior toward others, viewers started interpreting this as emotional maturity rather than just kindness, and that shift in perception explains why so many comments praised his upbringing and values, highlighting how personal conduct becomes a symbolic representation of broader social expectations. Tom's supporters frequently emphasized his gentle presence, which made me reflect on how different types of emotional resonance coexist. One built from humor and relatability, and the other from softness and empathy, both powerful but appealing to different viewer identities. What stood out to me most was how little negativity was directed at the final four, demonstrating that the season thrived on positive energy rather than conflict. And this unity among viewers made the final outcome feel more celebratory than confrontational, something rare in competitive formats. Many people expressed surprise at the size of the voting gap, but analyzing conversations reveals that this outcome was the natural result of overlapping fan groups merging behind Ginge, creating a cumulative effect that traditional celebrities often struggle to match in a digital age. Observing how viewers across different ages praised Ginge's humor showed how universal certain comedic styles can be, especially when they rely on honesty and spontaneity rather than sarcasm or shock, making humor one of the strongest emotional tools in audience engagement. The way parents spoke about their kids enjoying the show because of Ginge and H indicates that generational bridges form when personalities embody warmth and accessibility, reminding me that entertainment often mirrors the emotional climate of the households that consume it. People who believed the vote was influenced by online followers were expressing a fear of cultural transition, because when new forms of fame gain momentum, older systems feel threatened, yet this season proved that modern influence can coexist with traditional celebrity without diminishing viewer enjoyment. Tom's journey illustrated how vulnerability and calmness attract mature viewers who appreciate stability in high-pressure environments, and this type of viewer appreciation often leads to long-term support even after the show ends, proving that finishing second does not limit future potential. Comments joking that streaming is the new famous highlight a social truth. Influence has shifted platforms, not importance, and analyzing this trend reveals that celebrity is no longer defined by television appearances, but by consistent emotional connection with audiences across multiple spaces. One of the biggest psychological elements was the way humor throughout the season created emotional relief for viewers dealing with daily stress, and this function of entertainment, providing escape, likely contributed to the high engagement levels, showing how deeply people invest in personalities who brighten their routine. The repeated references to people hearing of contestants for the first time reminded me that viewers often equate personal awareness with cultural relevance, which can lead to tension but also demonstrates the diversity of modern entertainment consumption. When people commented that the votes would have been different if phone voting still existed, they raised an interesting point about accessibility and generational comfort with technology, prompting a broader reflection on how participation methods influence engagement and fairness. Ginge's win by such a wide margin became symbolic for many younger viewers who felt represented by digital culture for the first time in the show's history, revealing how entertainment evolves alongside societal identity shifts. What resonated deeply was how many viewers across all ages said they found him refreshing, because this word reflects emotional renewal, suggesting that audiences were looking for a personality who felt grounded, relatable, and unfiltered in a way that aligns with current social expectations. Tom's presence was often described as beautiful or warm, reflecting a desire among mature audiences for contestants who bring emotional clarity rather than chaos. And this preference shows how psychological needs influence voting behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Ginge's ability to adapt socially within the camp demonstrated emotional intelligence, and viewers responded strongly to this versatility, recognizing his capacity to be humorous, supportive, and down-to-earth simultaneously, a combination that naturally builds trust. When older viewers mentioned they had never heard of Ginge but enjoyed him regardless, it illustrated that identity barriers dissolve quickly when behavior aligns with universal values, creating emotional bridges between generations. The debate about followers influencing results reflects uncertainty about how modern platforms shape public opinion. Yet analyzing the behavior of viewers suggests that many cast their votes based on what they observed, rather than simply pre-existing loyalty, revealing a more balanced dynamic than critics assume. H's departure became a turning point because the emotional vacuum he left positioned Ginge as the primary comedic anchor, and viewers gravitated toward that role naturally, showing how social ecosystems adapt when one central figure exits. The admiration directed at the final four for being strong personalities reinforced how audiences value emotional diversity rather than uniformity, appreciating individuals who bring different strengths rather than competing versions of the same archetype. As the season ended, the collective reaction, full of humour, reflection, and generational comparisons, proved that entertainment does more than entertain. It reveals how people think, relate, and interpret identity, making this one of the most fascinating psychological seasons of the show.